This episode is supported in part by Sacred Wright's public scholarship on religion, gender, and sexuality through a grant from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. You can find Sacred Wrights online at sacred-rights.org and the Carpenter Foundation at carpenterfoundation.us. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Sohini Sarah Pillai to the show. Dr. Pillai is Assistant Professor of Religion, Director of Film and Media Studies, and the Marlene Crandell Francis Endowed Chair in the Humanities at Kalamazoo College. Her research interests include Hindu traditions, epic narratives, Indian cinema, and women in religion. She is the author of Krishna's Mahabharatas, Devotional Retellings of an Epic Narrative from Oxford University Press in 2024. On this episode, we discuss her fantastic family backstory surrounding religion, a bit about her academic journey and her book Krishna's Mahabharatas, and her in-progress monograph about cinematic adaptations of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Sohini Sarah Pillai. Dr. Sohini Pillai, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I am delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can kick this off by having you just introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So my name is Sohini Sarah Pillai. I'm an assistant professor of religion and the director of film and media studies at Kalamazoo College. I got my PhD from UC Berkeley, and I specialize in the study of Hindu traditions, epic narratives, Indian cinema, and women in religion.
Wonderful. I would love to know a little bit about that academic path that kind of led you through to becoming what you are today, a professor, and all these topics. So tell me a little bit about that journey and that pathway along the way.
Yeah. So I grew up in a suburb of Boston, Lexington, Massachusetts, which I feel a lot of us know as the birthplace of the American Revolution, Lexington and Concord. My parents both immigrated from India, and they both come from different religious backgrounds. So my dad grew up in a South Indian Hindu family, and my mother also grew up mostly in South India, but in an Anglo-Indian Brethren Protestant family. And so right off the bat, I had two different religious traditions growing up. And my father is also a very active and vocal atheist. So I feel like I got a lot of my kind of introduction to religion and religious practice from my two grandmothers who would come to stay with me in the U.S. for long periods of time. My mom's mother basically helped my parents raise me until the age of 12. My parents are both, they're also academics and physicians, but in medical world. So very different from what I do. And so they were quite busy while I was growing up. And so my grandma, who came from an Anglo-Indian Brethren Protestant family, she lived with us until I was 12. And my dad's mother, my Pati is what I called her. That's a word for grandmother in Tamil. She also would come and visit a lot. And so both of my two grandmothers, who actually, though they came from different religious backgrounds, got along really, really well. I have like so many memories of them watching like the Anita Hill trial and the O.J. Simpson trial, and them just like bonding over watching those in the 90s. But they would also tell me a lot of religious stories from the Bible, from my grandma, and from my Pati, a lot of different Hindu mythological stories and stories from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which were two religious narratives that I loved hearing stories about. And I work with both of these narratives now. And so and then my dad, who was atheist, so I feel like I had all of these different kinds of religious voices and different kinds of religious stories I grew up hearing. And in terms of being connected to my South Asian heritage, I think so. One was my pati, my grandmother, but the other was Bollywood movies, which a
Mm.
family friend introduced me to when I was 8 years old, and then I was hooked. And so growing up, I didn't actually learn any South Asian language because my parents both speak or were taught at least 4 to 5 different South Asian languages because they lived in many different parts of India, and they both also speak English fluently. And so they didn't really pick one to teach me growing up. But when I started watching these Bollywood films, which are in Hindi, and the older films had a lot more Urdu in them, um, I, I almost learned how to understand Hindi and Urdu fluently just from watching these movies.
Mm.
And then I studied them more formally when I went to college. But that is where I kind of did this interest in religion and film and media started.
It's so interesting to hear that story too, because whenever you hear the immigrant story of people coming like to an English speaking country from somewhere else, you hear so many people say, "Yeah, I learned so much from watching movies and television." That's kind of how where a lot of my fluency developed. So it's really interesting and fun to hear you talk about like learning Urdu or Tamil and things like that from watching films in Hindi.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Um, okay, so what about the academic path? Like, so you have this background, this family background, this interfaith, like multi-generational story. What about the academic path, and where does that come in?
Yeah, so I tell this to my students sometimes that sometimes I feel like I have a little bit of imposter syndrome being a religion professor in a religion department because I actually don't have a formal degree in religion. So
Mm.
I went to Wellesley College for undergrad, and I was strongly considering being a religion major. But I really wanted to learn more about specifically about South Asian languages. And my advisor at Wellesley, Dr. Neelima Shuklabhat, she was both in the religion department and in the South Asian Studies program. And so it kind of turned out that I took every single class about religion in South Asia, but I ended up with a South Asian Studies major and also a theater studies double major. It's kind of funny. My parents were like, "Oh, what kind of job are you going to get with a South Asian Studies major? I think you should get another major." And I was like, "Okay." And I picked theater, which I don't think is what they were looking for. But I also had a huge love of musical theater and playwriting and directing that also started from my childhood. And so I ended up being this double major in South Asian studies and theater studies, and I studied abroad in Delhi during my junior year. And I started this project about plays and religious conflict and religious harmony in India. And I got to like interview playwrights and I saw different kinds of shows. And then when I graduated from Wellesley, I actually got a Fulbright to India to do research about theatrical versions of the Ramayana, which is one of these two epic narratives that I currently work with and study. And it was interesting while I was in India during my Fulbright and doing research. And I was interviewing people. I kept on asking them for the scripts for the plays, and most of them didn't have scripts. And I was as I was transcribing interviews and interviewing people, I was like, "Huh, I think I actually really like the texts of these plays rather than the more like ethnographic kind of research." And so so after I graduated from Wellesley, and I did my first Fulbright, I went to Columbia for a MA in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, which that department is in the news quite a bit lately.
Mm.
But for, some unfortunate reasons, but
Unfortunate.
yes, I had a really fantastic experience in that department. And in that department, I got to start the study of Tamil, which is technically my father's mother tongue because he's from Tamil Nadu in South India, and the language that my pati grew up speaking and was a scholar of. And so it was really lovely that I got to start studying that language. And I also started studying Sanskrit there. So again, not studying religion per se, but my MA thesis was about different television and film and theatrical versions of the Ramayana. Um, And I also kind of developed this passion for comparing um, different versions of religious narratives in different South Asian languages that really don't have anything to do with each other. So Hindi, Urdu is a North Indian language also spoken in Pakistan, whereas Tamil is spoken in Sri Lanka and in South India, and they're not related to each other at all. Sanskrit isn't like the base language for Tamil like it is for Hindi or other North Indian languages. And so people are like, why are you comparing these narratives in these two different languages that have nothing to do with each other? And I was kind of like, why not? It's interesting to see. And so then in Berkeley, where I went for my PhD in the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies, again, still not religion, I started working with the Mahabharata, which is the other great epic narrative tradition of South and Southeast Asia, and specifically comparing Hindi and Tamil versions of the
Excellent.
Mahabharata. Yeah.
Yeah, so you have a book came out in 2024 called Krishna's Mahabharatas, Devotional Retellings of an Epic Narrative. It came out from Oxford Press.
Yeah.
Is that the PhD dissertation turned into a monograph?
Yes, that is what my dissertation kind of the next avatara of my dissertation is my book Krishna's Mahabharatas, which is about how and in pre-modern South Asia, so between 900 and like 1800 CE, all of these different regional poets, and again, South Asia is such a diverse linguistic region of the world. I think
Yeah.
in something like 27 official languages, and
Wow.
that's nothing to say of all the different dialects and other different languages, right? And so in the process of doing my dissertation, I realized that a lot of these poets and poets, again, in South India and North India, really not connected to each other, were doing something really interesting. And that was retelling the Mahabharata, which is a story about this massive war between two sets of paternal cousins. At the end of this war, 1.6 billion people are dead. It's not.
Mm.
It's a pretty depressing but amazing narrative. It's the longest poem in the world, the Sanskrit Mahabharata. But what these regional poets were doing, which was really interesting, was they were retelling the Mahabharata with Krishna at the center of the story. And so for listeners who might not be familiar with the Mahabharata, Krishna is an important character in the Mahabharata for sure. He's most well known for delivering the Bhagavad Gita, this sermon to one of the heroic princes on the good side, Arjuna, right before the battle, and convincing him basically to go to war. But I would compare him more to like Obi-Wan Kenobi in A New Hope, or
Yeah.
or Dumbledore in Harry Potter. And when I'm explaining to my students, it's like as if someone is telling the whole seven books of Harry Potter, but Dumbledore is the most important character. Like Harry's still doing all this stuff, but it's as if like, I don't know, Ron and Hermione suddenly like burst out into song praising Dumbledore in the middle of a battle or something like that.
Mm.
So, and it wasn't just happening in Hindi and Tamil. I did focus on two Mahabharatas for my dissertation and in this book, Krishna's Mahabharatas. But in Krishna's Mahabharatas, I talk about, I think, Mahabharatas in, I think, something like 11 different South Asian languages, not all of which I studied. I was pulling from other sources, but a lot of these Mahabharatas, and I talk about 40 different ones in this book, were retelling this story about this catastrophic, horrible war as a devotional narrative praising Krishna, which I found to be really interesting. And so that's what that book is about. And it's available from OUP.
Excellent. Perfect. Well, you've moved on a little bit from that into more writing about film and modern Indian cinema. So I want to get to that because I've always been slightly tangentially interested in the Indian film industry, but I've never talked about it on the podcast. Shockingly, in 300 plus episodes, this has never come up. So I am delighted to go here with you. I read a piece that you delivered in a talk called Gods and Demons on the Big Screen, Religion, Bollywood, and Ramayana, which I know is a larger piece of a project that you're working on. But before we get into the project specifically, tell listeners a little bit what we need to know about the film industry in India itself.
Sure. So India is the largest producer of movies in the world, with over 1,000 films being released each year, which is, I don't know how many films are released from Hollywood, but it's nowhere near that many. Um, One, I think, popular misconception is that all films that come out of India are Bollywood movies, right? And so Bollywood, that name comes from Bombay, which is the old name for Mumbai, which is where the Hindi film industry in India is based. But as I said before, right, India has so many different languages, like 27 different official languages, and there are multiple different film industries in India. So for example, the Telugu film industry in South India is called Tollywood. The Tamil film industry is Kollywood for the neighborhood in Chennai where the films originally were made, right? And so there's
Nice.
so many different film industries. Um, but Bollywood films are the ones I think of what when like Americans think of Indian movies, they think of Bollywood films, right? And so a lot of Bollywood films, not all of them, can be described as masala films. And so masala, which basically means spice mix, and it's called spice mix because there's so many different elements in these masala films, right? So there's action, but there's also romance and there's comedy and there's drama and also all of these movies, well, a lot of them are musicals, right? So there's song and dance numbers, and so a lot of Bollywood films are what we would call masala films. And I think the word masala film is also useful for describing a lot of other films that are made in other film industries in India. So a lot of Tamil films and Telugu films could be described as masala films as well. Um, Recently, we've seen a rise of this kind of movie called the Pan Indian film. So I think one movie that was on a lot of people's radar was RRR, which won the Oscar for Best Original Song a few years ago. And RRR was filmed in Telugu, but it was dubbed in multiple other South Asian languages as well, including Hindi and Tamil. And so now there are these big movies. And the thing about RRR, well, most of the stars were from Telugu cinema. There were also a lot of Bollywood actors too. So there are now these new really big budget films that are really popular in other parts of the world as well as India. And Bollywood films have been popular throughout the world, especially in the diaspora, but also in places like Russia. The number of older Russian people I've met who can quote lines from like old Hindi films from like the 40s and the 50s and songs. I'm always really delighted and impressed to see that. But these pan-Indian films, especially RRR, like was incredibly popular at the time when it came out. And so that film, I would again describe it as a masala film, but having elements of different film industries in India. And then I'll also quickly add that there was a parallel art cinema movement in India with a lot more films that again don't have all of these different kinds of masala elements, but that are also very popular, but are maybe more serious, don't have as big budgets and big casts and these musical numbers. But for example, like Satyajit Ray, the Apu trilogy, that's a good example of parallel art cinema. And those movies are still being made in India today in multiple different languages like Bengali and English.
Very cool. Well, I want to know a little bit about this current project that you're doing, which I read a piece of from the talk that you sent me. But tell me a little bit about the origin of your current project and what it is that you're doing with it.
Yeah. So my current larger book project, which is tentatively titled Epic Bollywood, Religion and Representation in Modern Indian Cinema. And again, while I'm using the word epic Bollywood, I am talking about films in other languages as well as a few films that are produced outside of India. One of which is this new movie, Monkey Man, that came out last year. So I like I said earlier, I've always been a huge fan of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata since I was a kid, and a fan of Indian cinema and Bollywood films. But I think this project really to come into being when I was teaching here at Kalamazoo College. I teach mostly classes on not South Asian cinema, sorry, South Asian religions. But I also teach a class about religion and Star Wars called Jedi, Sith, and Mandalorians,
Very
Religion and
cool.
Star Wars. And I teach a class called Religion, Bollywood, and Beyond, where we mostly watch Bollywood films and discuss them, but we also, for example, we watched Miss Marvel, and we watch some other TV shows and other films that are made outside of Bollywood. And I was also another class I teach is called Princesses, Demonesses, and Warriors: The Women of the South Asian Epics. And while I was teaching religion, Bollywood, and beyond, and then Princess, Demonesses, and Warriors, I noticed students who had taken both classes or one of the classes seeing connections between both of these classes. One class which is about the epics, the other which is about Indian cinema. And that was kind of eye-opening for me and made me realize just how many films that come out of India are inspired by or based on one of these two epics, the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. And so I know you were interested in like just how many of these films are there, right? And so um I it seems like there are hundreds. I haven't yet made like a tallying list, but like to just give you an example. So there's this very famous Telugu actor called NTR, and he appeared in 42 different films, which film scholars in South Asia describe as mythological films. So films that are based on the epics or other stories from Hindu mythology. And so out of these 42 films, 23 were based on the Mahabharata and 8 were based on the Ramayana alone for one actor. And he even directed and he wrote his own film. It was called Srimad Virata Parvam. And in this film, which he wrote and directed, he played 5 different Mahabharata characters in one film. I haven't seen it yet, but I want to. And so there's all of these different mythological films based on the epics. And I talk about a couple of them in my book, but I'm mostly looking at films that are set in contemporary South Asia or in the diaspora that are kind of like modern retellings of these epics. And I'm only looking at films from 1990 onwards. So I think there are a lot more. But so far, I think I'm discussing about 35 different films already, and I'm sure more will pop up.
And I'm sure that the editor of the project is going to be like, stop, that's enough, that's
I
enough.
know. I
Um,
know.
I'm like putting myself in the shoes of like a dissertation advisor trying to rein in a project, but I'd imagine that once you've got the dissertation, that the book process is a lot different. Are you finding this process to be a lot different than like translating a dissertation
Oh
into a
my.
book? Because I'm
So
sure
it's so
that's
different. Let's starting from scratch again is really interesting, but it's also like my field work is so different because for my dissertation project, I was like in archives in India and in the UK because colonialism. I was able to find manuscripts of both languages in one archive, which I would never find in India, but I was able to in London. And like looking at manuscripts and reading texts, and working with scholars in India. But literally my most of my work for this book has been like turning on Netflix and taking my laptop and sitting in front of the TV and watching movies and taking notes, which is so different, but it's also really fun. And rewatching movies I grew up with, which is really interesting, but very different from and then no one's like I don't have deadlines to send anyone my chapters and no one's like checking up on me. I do have friends who are very willing to read my work, but it is very different. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get into some of the less savory aspects of film and depictions, because I do know that there's like some unfortunate details that we're going to get into, but what are some of your favorite adaptations? If you had to recommend a couple of movies to people who are brand new to this genre of work, what would you be like, all right, watch these 3 things?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. So, my like all time one of my all-time favorite films is this Bollywood movie that came out in 2001. It's called Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gham, which means sometimes happiness, sometimes sorrow. And I saw this film when I was 10 years old or 11 years old in India in theaters, which is like a completely different experience than watching a movie in the US. Like people stand up and they like whistle and they cheer when like actors come on screen and they dance and they sing along. And so that was one of the first films I saw. So maybe that's why I have this nostalgia for the film. But it is, I argue in my book that it is a retelling of part of the Ramayana. For our listeners who don't know, the Ramayana is the story of this prince, Rama, who is an incarnation of the Hindu preserver deity Vishnu, who gets exiled from his home, and his wife and younger brother come with him. And then his wife gets kidnapped by a demon king, Ravana. And it's his journey to rescue his wife along with the help of his devoted monkey deity friend Hanuman. And it's a really fun and also powerful and amazing story. And so Kabhi Khushi Kabhie Gham is a retelling, I think, of the exile part of the story of the Ramayana, in which one of Rama's other brothers, not the one who came with him to exile, but the one who actually his stepmother wants to be king of his kingdom, comes back and tries to bring him home. And so here the exile is to London, not to the forest. And it's a rich billionaire who exiles his son because he doesn't marry the woman he wanted his son to marry. And it's very interesting because in this version of the story, I argue in my book that the devoted younger brother who goes to exile with him is actually his childhood nanny, and who is a Muslim woman, which is very interesting seeing this. And so that's one of my favorite films. I While RRR is very problematic, and we can talk about how problematic it is a very, very entertaining film that draws from both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which is very interesting. But another film that I recently saw that I really enjoyed was called Paradise, which is a film that was made by a Sri Lankan film director and is set in Sri Lanka. But the protagonists of the film are two people from South India who speak Malayalam from the state of Kerala who are doing these kinds of popular tourist trips to Sri Lanka that are kind of Ramayana tours, like because in the Ramayana, Ravana, the demon king, is based in Lanka, and so there's a lot of like Sri Lankan tourism now, like, oh, come see the place where Ravana held Sita prisoner, or where Hanuman met Sita in Lanka. And so this film is set during that setting and also during civil unrest in Sri Lanka, and it's a really interesting film. So I think I don't know if I feel responsible RRR because there's a lot of stuff wrong with it, but definitely Paradise, definitely Kabhi Khushi Kabhie Gham. Um, and if I had another one, which I would not feel any like guilt recommending, is there is an old Mahabharata, older in the sense of the films I'm writing about. I was one when it came out. It's called Pati by Mani Ratnam, and it is a retelling of the Mahabharata, but set in South India with like slumlords and politicians, and it's a very interesting film.
Excellent. Well, okay, so there is some less pleasant aspects of the writing that you talk about, and that is Islamophobia, casteism, patriarchy. You argue that the majority of modern Ramayana and Mahabharata films promote an Islamophobic, casteist, and patriarchal vision of India
Yeah.
rooted in Hindutva nationalism.
Mhm.
And I would like to know a little bit more about that and what we need to know about what you're noticing as far as those unfortunate aspects.
Yeah. So I in my book, I talk about films again that were made specifically after 1990 because there were a couple of important national events that were happening in the late 80s and the early 90s that I think have really had a profound impact on how the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are being retold in India, especially in cinema. And one of these events was the demolition of a mosque in Ayodhya, which is in North India in the state of Uttar Pradesh. And it was torn down in December of 1992. This mosque was built by the first Mughal, or was said to have been commissioned by the first Mughal emperor Babur in the 16th century. And supposedly, this mosque was first built by destroying a temple that marked the birthplace of Rama, who is the hero of the Ramayana and an important Hindu deity. And so there was a movement in the late 80s and early 90s. It took momentum in the late 80s and the early 90s to destroy this mosque and rebuild a temple for Rama. And so during this political movement, Muslims were compared to Ravana, the demon hero of the Ramayana. Not hero. Well, in some retellings of the Ramayana, he's a hero, but the main antagonist of the Ramayana, and to Rakshasas, or it's a word that's often translated as demon. And so there were comparisons being made, like just as Babur came and invaded India, right? Because the Mughals are not native South Asians, they're invaders, they're these Muslim invaders, and corrupted India. Ravana kidnapped Sita and corrupted her. And so there were all these comparisons being drawn between Muslims and demons and Ravana and these different Mughal emperors. And so in the first chapter of my book, I discuss at length how there are five different Bollywood films, three of which were very popular, one of which came out last year in November, that explicitly compare a Muslim character in the film, usually a Muslim villain, to Ravana. And this is immensely problematic because one, because Muslims are not demons, in case you didn't know that. But two, because there was this political movement in India that resulted in the demolition of this mosque in 1992, and in 2024, in January, finally, a temple was built where this mosque once stood. And it's a huge temple. It's been partially inaugurated. There were many Bollywood stars, many politicians, many other important people in India attending this temple inauguration. And during this week, there were also multiple cases of violence against both Muslims and Dalits, those formerly known as untouchables, right? People who are caste oppressed. And so for these films to come out that compare Ravana to a Muslim when this new temple has been inaugurated, given all of this really complex political history, it's really upsetting and dangerous.
Mm. What are we seeing in the film depictions that that you're looking for as far as like red flags go?
Well, the a lot of these films, depict Muslims as rapists and as the violators of Hindu and Sikh women. And I find this to be especially dangerous because right now in contemporary India, there is this big propaganda movement called Love Jihad or Love Jihad, if you're pronouncing it with an American accent, which is this propaganda message that's being spread by Hindu nationalists that Muslim men in India are marrying and seducing Hindu women and trying to convert them to Islam so that they can increase India's Muslim population. And there's multiple studies showing that this is not something that is happening at all. Muslims are a minority within India. A lot of Muslims are being targeted for being Muslim in India right now. But this love jihad message, I'm seeing it in a lot of different Bollywood films, and there's been some scholarship about this as well. But to have this kind of love jihad message put into a film that's based on the Ramayana is especially dangerous because the Ramayana is a narrative that not just Hindus are familiar with, but Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Zoroastrians. There's multiple retellings of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata that have been created for the past 2,000 years. And it's a story that just doesn't belong to people who are Hindu. But to retell the story in this way and to add this like narrative of Ravana trying to implement love jihad is again incredibly dangerous. And it also again propagates this myth of the dangerous Muslim, the Muslim rapist, the hypersexual Muslim man, right? Which we don't just see in South Asia, we see that in other parts of the world as well.
Absolutely. What's the timeline for this project for the book?
I'm hoping to have it done by sometime in 2026, maybe getting a book proposal, securing a contract this summer. I'm not sure. I would love to, but yeah, that's what I'm hoping for.
Excellent. Well, we came together because of your involvement with Sacred Rights. Tell me a little bit about what you gained from the Sacred Rights program and some of your hopes and dreams with regards to public scholarship.
Yeah. So I think my favorite part of the Sacred Rights program was honestly getting to hang out with Brooke Walensky Lanford and our cohort who are studying such different things. I was listening to Luke's interview with you that you published, I think, last week.
Yeah.
And it's so like the number of different kinds of projects again focused a lot of them on gender. In this book that I'm working on, I do talk about patriarchy quite a bit, especially with the character of Sita and Draupadi, two major female heroines. But it was so interesting getting to hear all of these different projects on different religious traditions, on different kinds of fields, like again, ethnography, textual studies, and we just became this really like tight knit group, and we're hoping to all meet at the AAR, the American Academy of Religion, in person because this was online. And I just feel like I have a network now of other scholars who I can depend on, and especially with everything that's going on in the world right now, a lot of our research is becoming a lot more relevant, but that also in some ways makes it scary to share what we work on, especially in these kind of public settings. And just, I think having that group and that cohort and getting to share with them has been really it almost felt like therapy once a week going to my sacred rights training and getting to talk with other scholars and learn about how sharing our research with a wider audience can be both beneficial, but also how it's important that we protect ourselves and protect our work.
Have you noticed anything specifically within your work and your content that you feel a little bit of, contemplating the risks and the rewards, like in balancing that?
Yeah. So honestly, even before I was working on this project, it's interesting because we talked about my religious background growing up, and I published under the name Sohini Sarah Pillai. Sarah is one of my middle names that my Protestant grandmother picked for me. And even just and like my book Krishna's Mahabharatas, I don't think it really had that much to do with Hindu nationalism or any of these kinds of heavier topics. But I have received online hate before, and trolls on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter anymore, which I think I'm is good for my mental health. And Hindu nationalists can be very scary, and they're very good at online stuff, and they're like everywhere online. And so sometimes I do feel a bit worried about um, this book project and if I'm going to be targeted and stuff like that. But at the same time, again, this book is about two of the most popular stories in South Asia, and one of the most popular ways to tell stories, which is cinema. And I think, if people do read my work and if I can get them to think differently about these films, like the message of my book is not that we should hate Bollywood, but 'cause I still love Bollywood. I love some of these
Mm.
films that are very problematic. Like sometimes I'm listening to the soundtrack of a film that has a lot of, you know, not great stuff in it, but the songs are bangers, and or
Yeah.
songs I grew up listening to, while I'm writing. So if I can get, other South Asians and other people who haven't maybe experienced these films to think differently about these films and to challenge and complicate the movies that they love and to think more critically about them, I think that's a really important reward. And I think, it's a responsibility too that we know what these messages, these films are sending out to viewers, and these different kinds of discrimination that we see in them.
Yeah. Well, I know you mentioned that you deleted Twitter, as did I, a while back, but
Yeah.
is there anywhere where people can find you if they would like to follow along with your work?
Yeah. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm at Sohini Pillai at bsky dot
Yeah.
social. And I also have another website where I do post some of my public scholarship, which is sohinisarahpillai.com.
Well, Dr. Sohini Sarah Pillai, thank you so much for joining me on Classical Ideas to talk about basically your life story and how it relates to all of the work that you've done throughout your PhD program and into your own teaching and into your continued academic journey. So thank you so much for being here. It really has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me again.